Alright, welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. Last we left off, we found out about the real secret of Misselwaith Manor. And now we'll hop right back into chapter 14, A Young Raha. The moor was hidden in mist when the morning came, and the rain had not stopped pouring down. There could be no going out of doors. Martha was so busy that Mary had no opportunity of talking to her, but in the afternoon she asked her to come and sit in the nursery. She came bringing the stocking she was always knitting when she was doing nothing else. "What's the matter with thee?" she asked as soon as they sat down. "You looks as you got something to say." "I have. I found out what the crying was." Martha let her knitting drop on her knee and gazed at her with startled eyes. "You haven't never." "I heard it in the night, and I got up and went to see where it came from. It was Colin. I found him." And Martha's face became red with fright. "Oh, Miss Mary, you shouldn't have done it. You shouldn't have. That'll get me in trouble. I never told you nothing about him, but that'll get me in trouble. I'll lose my place, and what'll Mother do?" "You won't lose your place. He was glad I came. We talked and talked, and he said he was glad that I came." "Was he? Are you sure? He doesn't know what he's like when anything vexes him. He's a big lad to cry like a baby. Just when he's in passion, he'll fresh scream just for sadness. He knows he daren't call her souls of her own." "He wasn't vexed. I asked him if I should go away, and he made me stay. He asked me questions, and I sat on a big footstool and talked to him about India and the robin and the gardens. He wouldn't let me go. He let me see his mother's pictures. Before I left him, I sang him to sleep." And Martha fairly gasped with excitement. I can scarcely believe you. It's as if you'd walked straight into a lion's den. If he'd have been like he is most times, he'd thrown himself into one of his tantrums and roused the whole house. Won't let strangers look at him." "He let me look at him. I looked at him all the time, and he looked at me. We stared." "I don't know what to do. If Miss Medlock finds out, she'll think I broke orders and told you, and then I'll be packed back to Mother." "Well, he isn't going to tell Miss Medlock anything about it yet. It's to be sort of a secret just at first. And he says everybody's obliged to do as he pleases." That's true enough, the bad lad," said Martha, wiping her forehead with her apron. "He says Miss Medlock must, and he wants me to come and talk to him every day, and you're to tell me when he wants me." "Me? I shall lose my place, I shall, for sure." "You can if you're doing what he wants you to do, and everybody's ordered to obey him." "Does you mean to say that he was nice to you?" cried Martha with wide-open eyes. "I think he almost liked me." "Then you must have bewitched him." "Do you mean magic? I've heard about magic in India, but I can't make it. I just went into his room, and I was so surprised to see him I stood and stared. Then he turned around and he stared at me, and he thought I was a ghost or a dream, and perhaps I thought he was. And it was it was so queer being there alone together in the middle of the night and not knowing about each other. And we began to ask each other questions, and when I asked him if I must go away, he said I must not." "The world's coming to an end." "What's the matter with him?" "Nobody sure knows for sure and for certain. Mr. Craven went off his head when he was born. Doctors thought he'd have to be put in an asylum. It's 'cause Miss Craven died, like I told you. He wouldn't set eyes on the baby. He just raved and said another hunchback like him had better die." "Is Colin a hunchback? He didn't look like one." "Well, he isn't yet, but he began all wrong. Mother said there was enough trouble in raising in the house to set any child wrong. They's afraid his back was weak, and they always been taking care of him, keeping him lying down, not letting him walk. Once they made him wear a brace, but he fretted so much he was downright ill. And a big doctor came to see him and made him take it off. Talked to another doctor quite rough, in a polite way. There'd been too much medicine, too much letting him have his own way." I think he's a very spoiled boy." "He's the worst young nut as ever was. I won't say he hasn't been ill a good bit. He's got coughs and colds that nearly killed him 2 or 3 times. Once he had the rheumatic fever, and once he had the typhoid. Well, Miss Medlock did get a fright then. He'd been out of his head, and she was talking to the nurse, thinking he didn't know nothing, and she said, 'He'll die this time, sure enough. Best thing for him is for everybody.' And she stared at him, and then there he was with his big eyes open, staring at her, sensible as she was herself. She didn't know what happened, but he stared at her and said, 'You give me some water and stop talking.'" "Do you think he'll die?" Mother says there's no reason why any child should live that gets no fresh air and doesn't do nothing but lie on his back and read picture books and take medicine. He's weak and hates the trouble of being taken out of doors, and he gets cold so easy and says it makes him ill. Mary sat and looked at the fire. I wonder if it wouldn't do him good to go out into a garden and watch things growing. It did me good. One of the worst fits he ever had was when they took him out by the rose where the roses is. By the fountain he'd been reading in a paper about people getting something he called rose cold. And he began to sneeze and then said he got it, and then a new gardener just didn't know the rules passed by and looked at him curious. Threw himself into a passion. He said he looked at him because he was going to be a hunchback, cried himself into a fever, and was ill all night. If he ever gets angry at me, I'll never go and see him again. He'll have you if he wants to. Yeah, you may as well know that to start. Very soon afterward, a bell rang, and she rolled up her knitting. I dare say the nurse wants me to stay with him a bit. Hope he's in good temper. She was out of the room about 10 minutes, and then she came back with a puzzled expression. Well, you bewitched him. He's up on a sofa with his picture books. Told the nurse to stay away till 6 o'clock. I'm to wait in the next room. The minute she's gone, he called me to him and says, I want Mary Lennox to come and talk to me. Remember, you're not to tell anyone, and you'd better go quick as you can. Mary was quite willing to go quickly. She didn't want to see Colin as much as she wanted to see Dickon, but she wanted to see him very much. There was a bright fire on the hearth when she entered his room, and in the daylight she saw it was a very beautiful room indeed. There were rich colors in the rugs and hangings and pictures and books on the walls, which made it look glowing and comfortable even in spite of the gray sky and falling rain. Colin looked rather like a picture himself. He was wrapped in a velvet dressing gown and sat against a big brocaded cushion. He had a red spot on each of his cheeks. Come in. I've been thinking about you all morning. I've been thinking about you too. You don't know how frightened Martha is. She says Miss Medlock would think she told me about you and then she'll be sent away. Then he frowned. Go and tell her to come here. She's in the next room. Mary went and brought her back, and poor Martha was shaking in her shoes, and Colin had a very obvious frown. Have you to do what I please, or have you not? I have to do what you please, sir. Has Medlock to do what I please? Everybody has, sir. Well, then, if I order you to bring Miss Mary to me, how can Medlock send you away if she finds it out? Please don't let her, sir. I'll send her away if she dares to say a word about such a thing. Oh, she wouldn't like that, I can tell you, said Mr. Craven grandly. Thank you, sir. I want to do my duty, sir. What I want is your duty. And Colin said this more grandly. She wouldn't like that, but, I'll take care of you. Now go away. When the door closed behind Martha, Colin found Mistress Mary gazing at him as if he had set her wondering. Why do you look at me like that? What are you thinking about? I'm thinking about two things. What are they? Sit down and tell me. This is the first one, Mary said, seating herself on the big stool. Once in India I saw a boy who was a Raja. He had rubies and emeralds and diamonds stuck all over him, spoke to his people just as you spoke to Martha. Everybody had to do everything he told them in a minute. I think they would have been killed if they hadn't. I shall make you tell me about Rajas presently, but first tell me what the second thing was. I was thinking about how different you are from Dickon. Who is Dickon? What a queer name. She might as well tell him. She thought she could talk about Dickon without mentioning the secret garden. She'd like to hear Martha talk about him. Besides, she longed to talk about him. It would seem to bring him nearer. He's Martha's brother. He's 12 years old. He's not like anyone else in the world. He can charm foxes and squirrels and birds, just as the natives in India charm snakes. He plays a very soft tune on a pipe, and they come and listen. There were some big books on a table at his side, and he dragged one suddenly toward him. There's a picture of a snake charmer in this, he exclaimed. Come and look at it. The book was a beautiful one, with superb colored illustrations, and he turned to one of them. Can he do that? He played on his pipe, and they listened. But he doesn't call it magic. He says it's because he lives on the moor and so much, and he just knows their ways. He says he feels sometimes as if he was a bird or a rabbit himself, and he likes them so much. I think he asked the rabbit questions. It seemed as if they talked to each other in soft chirps. Colin lay back on his cushion, and his eyes grew larger and larger, and the spots on his cheeks burned. Tell me some more about him. He knows all about eggs and nests, and knows where foxes and badgers and otters live. Keeps them secret so the other boys won't find their holes and frighten them. He knows about everything that grows or lives on the moor. Does he like the moor? How can he when it's such a great bare dreary place? It's the most beautiful place. Thousands of lovely things grow on it. There are thousands of little creatures, all busy building nests and making holes and burrows and chippering or squeaking or singing to each other. They're so busy and having such fun under the earth or in the trees and the heather. It's their world. How do you know all that? I've never really been there once, really. I only drove over it in the dark. But I thought it was hideous too. But Martha told me about it first, and then Dickon. And when Dickon talks about it, you feel as if you saw things and heard them, and if you were standing in the heather with the sun shining and the gorse smelling like honey, and all full of bees and butterflies. You never see anything if you're ill, said Colin restlessly. He looked like a person listening to a new sound in the distance and wondering what it was. You can't if you stay in a room. I couldn't go on the moor. Mary was silent for a minute, and then she said something bold. You might sometime. And he moved as if he were startled. Go on the moor? How could I? I'm going to die. How do you know? She didn't like the way he had of talking about dying. She didn't feel very sympathetic. She felt rather as if he almost boasted about it. Oh, I've heard about it ever since I remember. They're always whispering about it and thinking I don't notice. They wish I would, too. And Mistress Mary felt quite contrary. She pinched her lips together. If they wished I would, I wouldn't. Who wishes you would? The servants, and of course Dr. Craven, because he'd get Misselwaith and be rich instead of poor. He daren't say so, but he always looks cheerful when I'm worse. When I had typhoid fever, his face got quite fat. I think my father wishes it too. I don't believe that he does, said Mary quite obstinately. That made Colin turn and look at her again. Don't you? And he lay back on his cushion and was still, as if he were thinking. There was quite a long silence. Perhaps they were both of them thinking strange things children don't usually think. I like the Grand Doctor from London because he made them take the iron thing off. Did he say you were going to die? No. What did he say? He didn't whisper. Perhaps he knew I hated whispering. I heard him say one thing quite aloud. He said the lad might live if he would make up his mind to it. Put him in the humour. It sounded as if he was in a temper. I'll tell you who would put you in the humour, perhaps. She felt as if she would like this thing to be settled, one way or the other. I believe Dickon would. He's always talking about live things. He never talks about dead things or things that are ill. He's always looking up in the sky to watch birds flying, or looking down at the earth to see something growing. He has such round blue eyes, and they're so wide open with looking about, and he laughs such a big laugh with his wide mouth, and his cheeks are as red as cherries. And she pulled her stool closer to the sofa, and her expression quite changed at the remembrance of the wide curving mouth and the wide open eyes. See here, don't let us talk about dying. I don't like it. Let us talk about living. Let us talk about Dickon, and then we'll look at your pictures. It was the best thing she could have said. To talk about Dickon meant to talk about the moor and about the cottage and the 14 people who lived in it on 16 shillings a week, and the children who got fat on the moor grass like the wild ponies, and about Dickon's mother and the skipping rope and the moor with the sun on it, and the pale green points sticking up out of the black sod, and it was all so alive that Mary talked more than she'd ever talked before, and Colin both talked and listened as he'd never done before either. And they both began to laugh over nothings, as children will when they're happy together. and they laughed so that in the end they were making as much noise as if they'd been two ordinary, healthy, natural 10-year-old creatures, instead of a hard little unloving girl and a sickly boy who believed that he was going to die. They enjoyed themselves so much they forgot the pictures and they forgot about the time. They'd been laughing quite loudly over Ben Weatherstaff and his robin, and Colin was actually sitting up as if he'd forgotten about his week back when he suddenly remembered something. "Do you know there is one thing we've never once thought of? We're cousins." It seemed so queer because they'd talked so much and never remembered the simple thing that they laughed more than ever, because they'd gotten to the humor to laugh at anything. And in the midst of the fun the door opened and in walked Dr. Craven and Miss Medlock. Dr. Craven started in actual alarm, and Miss Medlock almost fell back because he'd accidentally bumped against her. "Good Lord!" exclaimed poor Miss Medlock with her eyes almost starting out of her head. "Good Lord!"
"What is this? What does it mean?"
And then Mary was reminded of the boy Raha again. Colin answered as if neither the doctor's alarm nor Miss Medlock's terror were of the slightest consequence. He was as little disturbed or frightened as if an elderly cat and dog had walked into the room. "This is my cousin, Mary Lennox. I asked her to come and talk to me. I like her. She must come and talk to me whenever I send for her." And Dr. Craven turned reproachfully to Miss Medlock. "Oh, sir, I don't know how it's happened. There's not a servant at the place that'd dare to talk. They have all their orders." "Nobody told her anything. She heard me crying and found me herself. I'm glad she came. Don't be silly, Medlock." Mary saw that Dr. Craven didn't look particularly pleased, but it was quite plain that he didn't oppose his patient. He sat down by Colin and felt his pulse.
I'm afraid there's been too much excitement. Excitement's not good for you, my boy."
"I should be excited if she kept away," answered Colin, his eyes beginning to look dangerously sparkling. "I'm better. She makes me better. The nurse must bring up her tea with mine. We'll have tea together." Miss Medlock and Dr. Craven looked at each other in a troubled way, but there was evidently nothing to be done. "He does look rather better, sir, but," thinking the matter over, "he looked better this morning before she came into the room." "She came into the room last night. She stayed with me a long time. She sang a Hindustani song to me and made me go to sleep. I was better when I wakened up. I wanted my breakfast. I want my tea now. Tell Nurse Medlock." Dr. Craven didn't stay very long. He talked to the nurse for a few minutes when she came into the room and said a few words of warning to Colin. He must not talk too much. He must not forget that he was ill. He mustn't forget that he was very easily tired. Mary thought that there seemed to be a number of uncomfortable things he was not supposed to forget. Colin looked fretful and kept his strange black-lashed eyes fixed on Dr. Craven's face. "I want to forget it. She makes me forget it. That's why I want her here." Dr. Craven didn't look happy when he left the room. He gave a puzzled glance at the little girl sitting on the large stool. She'd become a stiff, silent child again as soon as he entered, and he couldn't see what the attraction was. The boy actually did look brighter, however, and he sighed rather heavily as he went down the corridor. "They're always wanting me to eat things when I don't want to," said Colin as the nurse brought in the tea and put it on the table by the sofa. "Now, if you will eat, I will. Those muffins look so nice and hot. Tell me about Rahas." Chapter 15. Nest Building. After another week of rain, the high arc of the blue sky appeared again, and the sun which poured down was quite hot. Though there had been no chance to see either the secret garden or Dickon, Mistress Mary had enjoyed herself very much. The week hadn't seemed long. She'd spent hours of every day with Colin in his room, talking about Rahas, or gardens, or Dickon, and the cottage on the moor. They'd looked at the splendid books and pictures, and sometimes Mary had read things to Colin, and sometimes he had read a little to her. When he was amused and interested, she thought he scarcely looked like an invalid at all, except that his face was so colourless, and he was always on the sofa. "You're a sly little one to listen and get out of your bed to go following things like you did that night," Medlock had said once. "But there's no saying it hasn't been a sort of blessing to the lot of us. He's not had a tantrum or whining fit since you've made friends with him. The nurse was just going to give up the case because she was so sick of him, but she says she doesn't mind staying now that you've gone on duty with her." In her talks with Colin, Mary had tried to be very cautious about the secret garden. There were certain things she wanted to find out from him, but she felt she must find them out without asking him direct questions. In the first place, as she began to like to be with him, she wanted to discover whether he was the kind of boy you could tell a secret to. He was not in the least like Dickon, but he was evidently so pleased with the idea of a garden no one knew anything about, that she thought perhaps he could be trusted. But she hadn't known him long enough to be sure. The second thing she wanted to find out was this. If he could be trusted, if he really could, wouldn't it be possible to take him out to the garden without having anyone find it out? The Grand Doctor had said that he must have fresh air, and Colin had said that he wouldn't mind fresh air in a secret garden. Perhaps if he had a great deal of fresh air, and knew Dickon and the robin and saw things growing, he might not think so much about dying. Mary had seen herself in the glass sometimes lately, when she had realized that she looked quite a different creature from the child she'd seen when she arrived from India. This child looked nicer. Even Martha had seen a change in her. "The air from the moor's done you so good already. The air nice and yeller, and you're not so scrawny. Even the hair doesn't slam down on your head so flat it's got some life in it, so it sticks out a bit." "It's like me. It's growing stronger and fatter. I'm sure there's more of it." "Looks it for sure. They're not half so ugly when they're that way and there's a bit of red in your cheeks." If gardens and fresh air had been good for her, well, it would be good for Colin. But then, if he hated people to look at him, perhaps he wouldn't like to see Dickon. "Why does it always make you angry when you're looked at?" "I always hated it, even when I was very little. And then when they took me to the seaside and I used to lie in my carriage, everybody used to stare, and ladies would stop and talk to my nurse, and they'd begin to whisper, and I knew then they were saying I shouldn't live to grow up. And sometimes the ladies would pat my cheek and say, 'Poor child.' Once when a lady did that, I screamed out loud and bit her hand. She was so frightened she ran away." "She thought you'd gone mad like a dog." "I don't care what she thought." "I wonder why you didn't scream and bite me when I came into your room." Then she began to smile slowly. "I thought you were a ghost or a dream. You can't bite a ghost or a dream. And if you scream, they don't care." Would you hate it if a boy looked at you?" And he lay back on his cushion and paused thoughtfully. "There's one boy," he said slowly, clearly considering every word. "There's one boy I believe I shouldn't mind. It's the boy who knows where the foxes live, Dickon." "I'm sure you wouldn't mind him." "The birds don't, and other animals," he said, still thinking it over. "Perhaps that's why I shouldn't. He's sort of an animal charmer, and I'm a boy animal." And then he laughed, and she laughed too. In fact, it ended in both their laughing a great deal, and finding the idea of a boy animal hiding in his hole very funny indeed. What Mary felt afterward was she need not fear about Dickon. On that first morning when the sky was blue again, Mary wakened very early. The sun was pouring in slanting rays through the blinds. There was something so joyous in the sight of it that she jumped out of bed and ran to the window. She drew up the blinds and opened the window itself, and a great waft of fresh scented air blew in upon her. The moor was blue, and the whole world looked as if something magic had happened to it. There were tender little fluting sounds, here and there and everywhere, as if scores of birds were beginning to tune up for a concert. Mary put her hand out the window and held it in the sun. "It's warm, warm. It'll make the green points push up and up and up, and it'll make the bulbs and roots work and struggle with all their might under the earth." She kneeled down and leaned out of the window as far as she could, breathing big breaths and sniffing the air until she laughed, because she remembered what Dickon's mother had said about the end of his nose quivering like a rabbit's. "It must be very early. The little clouds are all pink, and I've never seen the sky look like this. No one's up. I don't even hear the stable boys." A sudden thought made her scramble to her feet. "I can't wait. I'm going to see the garden." She had learned to dress herself by this time, and she put on her clothes in 5 minutes. She knew a small side door which she could unbolt herself, and she flew downstairs in her stocking feet and put on her shoes in the hall. She unchained and unbolted and unlocked, and when the door was open, she sprang across the step with one bound, and there she was standing on the grass, which seemed to have turned green, and with the sun pouring down on her, and warm sweet wafts about her, and the fluting and twittering and singing coming from every bush and tree, she clasped her hands for pure joy, and looked up in the sky, and it was so blue and pink and pearly and white and flooded with springtime light that she felt as if she must flute and sing aloud herself, and knew that thrushes and robins and skylarks couldn't possibly help it. She ran toward the shrubs and paths outside the secret garden. "It's all different already. The grass is greener, and things are sticking up everywhere, and things are uncurling, and green buds of leaves are showing. This afternoon I'm sure Dickon will come." The long, warm rain had done strange things to the herbaceous beds which bordered the walk by the lower wall. There were things sprouting and pushing out from the roots of clumps of plants, and there were actually here and there glimpses of royal purple and yellow unfurling among the stems of crocuses. 6 months before, Mistress Mary wouldn't have seen how the world was waking up, but now she missed nothing. When she'd reached the place where the door hid itself under the ivy, she was startled by a curious loud sound. It was the caw, caw of a crow, and it came from the top of a wall, and when she looked up, there sat a big, glossy-plumaged, blue-black bird, looking down at her very wisely indeed. She'd never seen a crow so close before, and he made her a little nervous, but the next moment he spread his wings and flapped away across the garden. She hoped he wasn't going to stay inside, and she pushed the door open, wondering if he would. When she got fairly into the garden, she saw that he probably did intend to stay, because he had alighted on a dwarf apple tree, and under the apple tree was lying a little reddish animal with a bushy tail, and both of them were watching the stooping body and rusty red head of Dickon, who was kneeling on the grass working hard. Mary flew across the grass to him. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon, how did you get here so early? How could you? The sun's only got up." And he got up himself, laughing and glowing and tousled, his eyes like a bit of the sky. "Well, I was up long before him. How could I stay to bed? World's all fair begun again this morning, has. It's been working and humming, scratching, piping, and nest building, breathing out since. You got to be out now instead of lying on your back. The sun jumped up, the moor went mad for joy, and I was missed to the heather. Run like mad myself, shouting and singing, and I come straight here. Couldn't have stayed away. The garden was lying here waiting." And Mary put her hands on her chest, panting as if she'd been running herself. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon, I'm so happy I can scarcely breathe." Seeing him talking to a stranger, the little bushy-tailed animal rose from its place under the tree and came to him, and the rook, cawing once, flew down from its branch and settled quietly on his shoulder. "It's a little fox cub," he said, rubbing the little reddish animal's head. "His name Captain. This here Suit. He flew across the moor with me, Captain. He run the same as the hounds had been after him. Both felt the same as I did." Neither of the creatures looked as if he were the least afraid of Mary. When Dickon began to walk about, Suit stayed on his shoulder, and Captain trotted quietly close to his side. See how he's pushed up, and these, and oh, look at these here!" Threw himself onto his knees, and Mary went down beside him. They had come upon a huge clump of crocuses burst into purple and orange and gold. Mary bent her face down and kissed them. "You never kiss a person in that way," she said when she lifted her head. "Flowers are so different." He looked puzzled but smiled. "Well, I kissed my mother many a time that way when I came in from the moor after a day's roaming. She stood there in the door in the sun looking so glad and comfortable." They ran from one part of the garden to another, and found so many wonders that they were obliged to remind themselves they must whisper or speak low. He showed her swelling leaf buds on rose branches, which had seemed dead. He showed her 10,000 new green points pushing through the mold. They put their eager young noses close to the earth and sniffed its warm springtime breathing. They dug and pulled and laughed low with rapture, until Mistress Mary's hair was almost as tumbled as Dickon's, and her cheeks were almost as poppy red as his. There was every joy on earth in the secret garden that morning, and in the midst of them came a delight more delightful than them all, because it was more wonderful. Swiftly something flew across the wall and darted through the trees to a close-grown corner, a little flare of red-breasted bird with something hanging from its beak. Dickon had stood quite still and put his hand on Mary almost as if they'd suddenly found themselves laughing in church. "Well, I'm sure.
I mustn't scarce breathe. I knowed he was mate hunting when I seed him last, spending weather staffs from him. He's building his nest. He'll stay here if we don't fight him. They settled down softly upon the grass and sat there without moving. I just mustn't seen that we were watching him for too close. He'll be out with us for good if he got the notion we was interfering now. He's got a good bit different till this is all over. He's setting up housekeeping to be shyer and readier to take things ill. I ain't got no time for visiting and gossiping. Us must keep trash still a bit and try to look as if us grass and trees and bushes. That's when he got used to seeing us. And I'll chirp a bit and he'll know it's us not being in his way.
Mistress Mary wasn't sure how he knew all that. Mistress Mary was not at all sure that she knew, as Dickens seemed to, how to try to look like grass and trees and bushes, but he'd said the most strange thing as if it were the most simplest and natural thing in the world, and she felt it must be quite easy to him. And indeed she watched him for a few minutes carefully, wondering if it was possible for him to quietly turn green and put out branches and leaves. But he only sat wonderfully still. When he spoke, dropped his voice to such a softness. It was curious that she could hear him, but she could. It's just a part of springtime, this nest building is. Warren has been going on the same way every year since the world begun. They got their own way of thinking and doing things. The body better not meddle. Lose a friend in springtime easier than another season if you're too curious.
If we talk about him, I can't help looking at him. We must talk of something else. There's something I want to tell you.
You'll like it better if us talks of something else. What you got to tell me?
Well, do you know about Colin?
And he turned his head to look at her.
What do you know about him?
I've seen him. I've come to talk to him every day this week. He wants to come. Or he wants me to come. He says I'm making him forget about being ill and dying.
And Dickon actually looked relieved as soon as the surprise died away from his round face.
I'm glad of that. That makes me glad. It makes me easier. I know I must say nothing about him, and I don't like having to hide things.
Don't you like hiding the garden?
I'll never tell about it, but I says to Mother, I got a secret to keep, but it's not a bad one, and he knows that. It's no worse than hiding where a bird's nest is, and you don't mind it, do you?
And Mary always wanted to hear about his mother.
What did she say?
Dickon grinned sweet-temperedly.
It was just like her what she said. She gave my head a bit of a rub and laughed and said, "Oh, lad, you can have all the secrets you like. I've known you 12 years.
How did you know about Colin?
Everybody knowed about Mr. Craven. There's a little lad that was like to be a cripple. They knowed Mr. Craven didn't like him to be talked about. Folks is sorry for Mr. Craven, because Mrs. Craven was such a pretty young lady. They was awfully fond of each other. Miss Medlock stops in her cottage whenever she goes to Thwaite, and she doesn't mind talking to Mother for us children, because she knows we've been brought up to be trusty. How'd they find out about him? Martha was in fine trouble last time she came home. She said that she'd heard him fretting and was asking questions that she didn't know what to say."
Mary told him her story about the midnight wuthering of the wind which had wakened her, and about the faint far-off sounds of the complaining voice which had led her down the dark corridors with her candle, and ended with her opening the door of the dimly lighted room with the carven four-posted bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory-white face and the strange black-rimmed eyes, Dickon shook his head.
"They was just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughing. They say as Mr. Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake, and it's 'cause his eyes is so like his mother's. And well, yet he looks so different in his miserable bit of face."
You think he wants to die?
"No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother says it's the worst thing on earth for a child. Them is not one scarce ever thrives. Mr. Craven need buy anything his money could buy for the poor lad. But he'd like to bring it his own earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him one day and find that he's grown hunchback."
Colin's so afraid of it himself, he won't sit up. He says he's always thinking that he should feel a lump coming, he should go crazy and scream himself to death.
Well, he oughtn't to lie there thinking things like that. No lad could get well thinking of them sort of things.
The fox was lying on the grass close by him, looking up
ask for a pat now and then, and Dickon bent down and rubbed his neck softly, and thought a few minutes in silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked round the garden. "When we first got in here it seemed like everything was grey. Look round now, tell me if there doesn't see a difference." Mary looked and caught her breath a little.
The grey wall is changing. It's like a green mist is creeping over it. It's almost like a green gauze veil."
"And it'll greener and greener till the grey's all gone. Can you guess what I was thinking?"
"I know it was something nice. I believe it was something about Colin."
"I was thinking if he was out here he wouldn't be watching for lumps to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break on the rose bushes, and he'd be likely to be healthier. I was wondering if us could ever get him in the humour. Come out here and lie under the trees in his carriage."
"I've been wondering that myself. I've thought of it almost every time I've talked to him. I've wondered if he could keep a secret, and I've wondered if we could bring him here without anyone seeing us. I thought perhaps you could push his carriage. The doctor said he must have fresh air, and if he wants us to take him out, no one dare disobey him. He won't go out for other people, and perhaps they'll be glad if he'll go out with us. He could order the gardeners to keep away so they wouldn't find out."
Dickon was thinking very hard as he scratched the captain's back. "It'll be good for him, I warrant. Us not be thinking he'd never been born. Just be two children watching a garden grow, and he'd be another one. Two lads and a little lass just looking at the springtime, warrant it'd be better than any doctor stuff."
"He's been lying in his room so long, and he's always been afraid of his back, that it's made him strange. He knows a good many things out of books, but he doesn't know anything else. Says he's been too ill to notice things, and he hates going out of doors, and hates gardens and gardeners. But he likes to hear about this garden because it's a secret. I daren't tell him much, but he said he wanted to see it."
"Well, we'll have him out here sometime for sure. I could push his carriage well enough. And have you noticed how the robins and mate's been working on while we've been sitting here? Look at him perched on that twig, wondering where it'd be best to put that branch he's got in his beak."
He made one of his low, whistling calls, and the robin turned his head and looked at him inquiringly, still holding his twig. Dickon spoke to him as Ben Weatherstaff did, but Dickon's tone was one of friendly advice.
"Wherever you put it, it'll be all right. You know how to build the nest before you came out of the egg. Get on with you. You got no time to lose."
"Oh, I do like to hear you talk to him," Mary said, laughing delightedly. Ben Weatherstaff scolds him and makes fun of him, and he hops about and looks as if he'd understand every word, and I know he likes it, but Weatherstaff says he's so conceited that he'd rather have stones thrown at him than not be noticed."
And Dickon laughed too and went on talking. "Well, you know you won't trouble us, just being near wild things yourselves. Us is near nest building too, bless you. It doesn't look like they look all nervous."
And though the robin didn't answer because his beak was occupied, Mary knew that when he flew away with his twig to the own corner of the garden, the darkness of his dew-bright eye meant that he would not tell their secret for the world. Chapter 16. "I won't," said Mary. They found a great deal to do that morning, and Mary was late in returning to the house, and was also in such a hurry to get back to her work that she quite forgot Colin until the last moment. "Tell Colin I can't come and see him yet. I'm very busy in the garden." But Martha looked rather frightened.
Miss Mary put him all out of humour when I tell him that."
But Mary wasn't as afraid of him as other people were. She was not a self-sacrificing person. "I can't stay. Dickon's waiting for me," and she ran away. The afternoon was even lovelier and busier than the morning had been. Already neatly all the weeds were cleared out of the garden, and most of the roses and trees had been pruned or dug about. Dickon had brought a spade of his own, and he taught Mary to use all her tools, so that by this time it was plain that though the lovely wild place was not likely to become a gardener's garden, it would certainly be a wilderness of growing things before the springtime was over.
Them will be cherry blossoms and apple blossoms overhead. There'll be peach and plum trees all bloom against the walls, and the grass will be a carpet of flowers," Dickens said, working away with all his might. The little fox and the rook were as happy and busy as they were, and the robin and his mate flew backward and forward like tiny streaks of lightning. Sometimes the rook flapped over in his black wings, and he soared away over the tree-tops in the park. Each time he came back and perched near Dickon and cawed several times as if he were relaying his adventures, and Dickon talked to him just as he talked to the robin. Once, when Dickon was so busy that he didn't answer him at first, Scott flew onto his shoulders and gently tweaked at his ear with his large beak. And when Mary wanted to rest a little on Dickon, she sat down with her under a tree, and once he took out his pipe of the pocket and played the soft little strange notes, and the two squirrels appeared on the wall and listened. "That's a good bit stronger than you was," Dickon said, looking at her as she was digging. "The beginning was to look different, for sure." Mary was glowing with exercise and good spirits.
"I'm getting fatter and fatter every day. Miss Medlock will have to get me some bigger dresses. Martha says my hair is growing thicker. It's not so flat and stringy."
The sun was beginning to set, and sending deep gold-colored rays slanting from under the trees when they parted. "It'll be fine tomorrow. I'll be at work by sunrise."
"So will I."
She ran back to the house as quickly as her feet could carry her.
She wanted to tell Colin about Dickens' Fox Club and the Rook, and about the springtime that she'd been doing. She felt sure that he would like to hear, so it wasn't the most pleasant when she appeared at the door of her room to see Martha standing, waiting for her with a doleful face.
"What's the matter? Did Colin say what you told him when I wouldn't come?"
"Oh, I wish they'd go.
I wish they'd gone. He was nigh going in one of his tramples. There's been a nice to-do afternoon, all to keep him quiet. He'd watch the clock all the time if he could."
Mary's lips pinched themselves together. She was no more used to considering other people than Colin was, and she saw no reason why this ill-tempered boy shouldn't interfere with a plan of the things she liked best. She knew nothing about the pitifulness of people who had been ill and nervous, and didn't know that they could control their tempers, and didn't know that could make other people nervous too. When she had had a headache in India, she had done her best to sorry, I've lost my place. When she had a headache in India, she'd done her best to see that everybody else also had a headache or something quite as bad, and she felt that she was quite right. But of course, now she felt that Colin was lying. Or at least quite wrong. He was not on his sofa when she went to his room. He was lying flat on his back in bed. He didn't turn his head as she came up to him. This was a bad beginning, and Mary marched up for him with a stiff manner. "Why didn't you give up?"
"I didn't get up this morning."
I did get up this morning when I thought you were coming. Made them and then put me back in bed after this afternoon. My back ached and my headache was tiring. Why didn't you come? I was working in the garden with Dickon." Colin frowned and condescended to look at her.
I won't let that boy come here if you go and stay with him instead of coming to talk to me."
And Mary flew into a fine passion. She could fly into a passion without making a noise. She just grew sour and obstinate and didn't care what happened.
"If you send Dickon away, I'll never come to this room again."
"You'll have to if I want to."
"I won't."
"I'll make you. They'll drag you in."
"Shall they, Mr. Raha?" "They may drag me in, but they can't make me talk when I get here. I'll sit and clench my teeth and never tell you one more thing. I won't even look at you. I'll stare at the floor."
They had a nice agreeable pair as they glared at each other. If it had been for the two little street boys, they'd have sprung at each other. Had a rough and tumble fight. As it was, they did find the next thing to it.
"You're a selfish thing."
"What are you? Selfish? People always say that. Anyone's selfish when they don't do what they want. You're more selfish than I am. You're the most selfish boy I ever saw."
"I am not. I'm not as selfish as your fine Dickon is.
He keeps you by playing in the dirt where he knows I'm all by myself. He's selfish if you like."
Mary's eyes flashed fire.
"He's nicer than any other boy that ever lived. He's like an angel."
Might sound rather silly to say, but she didn't care.
"A nice angel. He's a common cottage boy."
"He's better than a common Raha. He's 1,000 times better."
Because she was stronger than men. Because she was stronger than two. She was beginning to get the better of him. The truth was that he'd never had a fight with anyone like himself in his whole life, and upon the whole, it was rather good for him, though neither he nor Mary knew anything about that. He turned his head on his pillow and shut his eyes, and a big tear squeezed out and ran down his cheek. He was beginning to feel pathetic and sorry for himself, not for anyone else.
"I'm not as selfish as you, because I'm always ill and I'm sure there's a lump coming on my back."
"And you're not going to die besides. Or rather, and I'm going to die by decides."
"You're no."
Or, You're
not,"
contracted Mary unsympathetically. He opened his eyes wide with indignation. He'd never heard such a thing said before. He was at once furious and slightly pleased. If a person could be this...
"I'm not. I am. You know I am. Everybody says so."
"I don't believe it. You just say that to make people worry."
"I believe you're proud of it. I don't believe it. If you were a nice boy, it might be true, but you're too nasty."
In spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed, in quite of the...
"I'm going and I won't come back."
So she launched into the air. She walked to the door, and when she reached it, oh golly, I seem to have very much lost my place.
I believe you're proud of it. I don't believe if you were a nice boy, it might be true, but you're too nasty."
And in spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed in quite a healthy rage.
"Get out of the room,"
he shouted, and he caught hold of his pillow and threw it at her. He wasn't strong enough to throw it far, and it only fell at her feet, and Mary's face looked as pinched as a nutcracker.
"I'm going, and I won't come back."
She walked to the door, and when she had reached it, she turned round and spoke again.
"I was going to tell you all sorts of nice things. Dickon brought his fox and his rook, and I was going to tell you all about them. Now I won't tell you a single thing."
And she marched out of the door and closed it behind her, and to her great astonishment she found the trained nurse standing as if she'd been listening and More amazing still, she was laughing. She was a big, handsome young woman who ought not to have been a trained nurse at all, as she couldn't bear invalids, and she was always making excuses to leave Colin to Martha or anyone else who would take her place. Mary had never liked her, and she simply stood and gazed up at her as she stood giggling into her handkerchief.
"What are you laughing at?"
"At you two young ones.
It's the best thing that could happen to the sickly pampered thing to have someone stand up to him that's as spoiled as himself."
And she laughed into her handkerchief again.
"If he had a young vixen of a sister to fight with, it would have been the saving of him."
"Is he going to die?"
"I don't know, and I don't care. Hysterics and temper are half what ails him."
"What are hysterics?"
"You'll find out if you work him into a tantrum after this, but at any rate, you've given him something to have hysterics about, and I'm glad of it."
Mary went back to her room, not feeling at all as she had felt when she'd come in from the garden. She was cross and disappointed, but not at all sorry for Colin. She looked forward to telling him a great many things, and she'd meant to try to make up her mind whether it would be safe to trust him with a great secret. She'd been beginning to think it would be, but now she had changed her mind entirely. She would never tell him, and he could stay in his room and never get any fresh air and die if he liked. It would serve him right. She felt so sour and unrelenting that for a few minutes she almost forgot about Dickon and the green veil creeping over the world and the soft wind blowing down from the moor. Martha was waiting for her, and the trouble in her face had been temporarily replaced by interest and curiosity. There was a wooden box on the table, and its cover had been removed and revealed that it was full of neat packages. "Mr. Craven sent it to you. It looks as if it had picture books in it." Mary remembered what he had asked her the day after she'd gone to his room. "Do you want anything? Dolls, toys, books?" She opened the package, wondering if he'd sent a doll, and also wondering what she would do with it if he had. But he hadn't sent one. There were several beautiful books such as Colin had, and 2 of them were about gardens and were full of pictures. There were 2 or 3 games. There was a beautiful little writing case with a gold monogram on it and a gold pen and inkstand. Everything was so nice that her pleasure began to crowd her anger out of her mind. She hadn't expected him to remember her at all, and her hard little heart grew quite warm.
"I can write better than I can print, and the first thing I shall write with that pen will be a letter to tell him I'm much obliged."
If she'd been friends with Colin, she would have run to show him her presents at once, and they would have looked at the pictures and read some of the gardening books and perhaps tried playing the games, and he would have enjoyed himself so much he would have never once thought he was going to die or put his hand on his spine to see if there was a lump coming. He had a way of doing that which she could not bear. It gave her an uncomfortable, frightened feeling, because he always looked so frightened himself. He said that if he felt even quite a little lump some day, he should know his hunch had begun to grow. Something he'd heard Miss Medlock whispering to the nurse had given him the idea, and he thought it over in secret, until it was quite firmly fixed in his mind. Miss Medlock had said his father's back had begun to show its crookedness in that way when he was a child. He had never told anyone but Mary that most of his tantrums, as they called them, grew out of his hysterical hidden fear. Mary had been sorry for him when he had told her.
"He always began to think about it when he was cross or tired, and he's been cross today. Perhaps he's been thinking about it all afternoon."
And she stood still, looking down at the carpet and thinking.
"I said I would never go back again,"
knitting her brows as she spoke.
"But perhaps, just perhaps, I'll go and see. If he wants me in the morning, perhaps he'll try to throw his pillow at me again, but I think I'll go."
And I think that's where we'll leave off this evening. A little bit shorter recording than usual, but I started a bit later than average as well, so I will see you all next Thursday. And this has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.